Welcome back to my kitchen. Join me this weekend as I work on a few small projects that I've had on my to-do list to stock up our pantry. It's time for me to start dealing with some of the stuff in our freezer and getting it into jars and onto the pantry shelf. I'm starting out with prepping some tomatoes to can up today. In the summer, when we have tomatoes coming in from the garden, oftentimes I will throw the bulk of our tomatoes into the freezer, and that way I'm not so pressured to get everything dealt with fresh in a time crunch. I can just pop them in the freezer to deal with when things slow down a little bit, and I have a little bit less on my to-do list. The great thing about this is that if you're using your tomatoes for tomato sauce, freezing them makes it really easy to remove the skins. You can score the bottoms of the tomatoes before you put them in a freezer bag to make them even easier to peel, but I typically just wash them and core them. I didn't even core all of these, but it's easy to pull out the core after they've thawed as well. I've gotten to a point where I know that a gallon Ziploc bag pretty consistently holds about 5 pounds of tomatoes, which makes it really easy when I go to can up a recipe. As the tomatoes thaw, a lot of the liquid is released, which is also going to help a sauce cook down a lot faster. You can save the liquid that drains off and use it in place of broth and soups and whatnot. I had pulled out the tomatoes I'm canning the night before and just set those out to begin to thaw. Now, as I remove the skins, I'm just putting those aside to give to the chickens, but another thing that you can do with the skins if you don't want to let them go to waste is you can dehydrate them too and then grind them up to make a tomato powder, and that can be used to thicken in place of tomato paste. You can also just stir some water into that powder to create a tomato paste. But I didn't have enough today in this batch to make it worthwhile to run the dehydrator, so I went ahead and just gave those to the chickens. I'm doing a single batch of tomato sauce that I know will fit into my Dutch oven, and that will make for one batch in the waterbath canner as well. I'm not doing any massive batches this weekend. I'm just slowly chipping away at my to-do list, and this is kind of my preference. I love doing this type of stuff. It's a hobby for me as much as it is productive, and it just feels a little bit less daunting to do smaller batches like this. I'm also dicing up some yellow onion along with chopping up a bunch of garlic. I'll leave the recipe that I use for the pasta sauce in the description box down below. This has become my favorite, and I've been making it pretty consistently over the last few years. Now, I'm not too concerned with how small or uniform these are because it's all just going to get blended into the sauce eventually. I have my Dutch oven heating over medium-low heat with just a tiny bit of olive oil in there, like maybe a half teaspoon or so, just because I do want to begin to cook that garlic and onions to develop a little bit of color. That's going to add a lot of good flavor to the sauce. Once I'm seeing a little bit of color on those, I'll go ahead and add in the tomatoes. I was really trying to pack the tomatoes in here, so this was something that I kind of had to do in batches. I added in as many tomatoes as I could fit into the pot, allowed that to start to cook down a little bit, and then I went in and added in the rest of the tomatoes. I like to keep my pasta sauce pretty simple, and I just season it with some salt, some dried basil, and oregano. I do also add in a little bit of brown sugar. You can totally leave that out, but I like the little bit of sweetness that it adds to the sauce, and in the scheme of how much this batch makes, I'm not worried about the little bit of added sugar. Gave all of that a stir. I'm going to get this tomato mixture simmering, and I'll allow it to simmer for at least a couple hours, just stirring it occasionally. I'm going to cover the pot, and as the tomatoes begin to soften, I'll go through with an immersion blender. I had a loaf of gluten-free sourdough bread that I started the night before, so I continued on with that. Now, gluten-free sourdough behaves much differently than regular sourdough, or this is really just the difference between gluten-free versus regular baking. So I am transferring that into a cold Dutch oven. I'm not putting it into a hot Dutch oven like you might with a traditional sourdough. And I also like to add a little bit of rice at the bottom of the pot before I put a piece of parchment paper down, and that just helps the bread from burning on the bottom or getting a little bit too crusty, especially with gluten-free sourdough since the cook time is a lot longer than a traditional sourdough. I don't do much in the way of scoring. Again, is another difference between gluten-free and regular. It just does not show up the same way. But I covered that Dutch oven, got it into the oven, and it will bake partway with the lid on, and then I'll remove the lid to continue baking. It had been a while since I had made up a batch of gluten-free sourdough, so it felt good to restock on that. It's delicious, and a bunch of it ended up going into the freezer for later enjoyment. The tomatoes for my sauce are really starting to break down, and I just gave that another good stir, and I used my immersion blender to get it all blended up into a sauce. Now, you can put this through a food mill if you want to remove the seeds. I don't mind them in there, so I just leave it like this. And then I like to allow it to simmer for a little bit longer. That way some of the air bubbles that are created as you blend it can kind of just dissipate before I go ahead and fill my canning jars. These are my favorite jars to can pasta sauce or any sort of tomato sauce in. They are 1.5 pints in size, and they can be a little bit hard to track down, so anytime I do see them, I will typically pick up a case to have on hand. And I like to do my sauce in these because this is closer in size to a jar of pasta sauce that you'd buy at the store. And also, we buy gluten-free pasta, and it seems now that most gluten-free pasta available is not sold in a full pound. It's a little bit less than that. So doing a full quart of tomato sauce just ends up being a little bit too much. So I'm adding in some bottled lemon juice to my jars. You can also add in citric acid. You're going to need one of the two to help acidify the sauce to make it safe for water bath canning. Again, I will have the full recipe for this sauce in the description box down below. Filling my jars to 1/2 inch of headspace, and then I'll get the rims all cleaned up and get some lids on, and these are going to be ready to process in the canner. You're not going to see processing times for this size jar on your canning recipes, so if you're not using a standard size jar like this, then you're going to want to bump up the processing time to the next size jar. So in this case, I'm going to be processing for the time for quarts. I broke my bread knife recently, and cutting into crusty sourdough without one made me realize just how badly I needed to replace it, so I went and did that the next day. I'm so impressed by the rise that I got on this gluten-free loaf. It turned out really well, and this is just sourdough starter, no additional yeast added. Turned out perfect. Another thing that I've been needing to restock our pantry with is some home canned chicken. Now, I always like to have a little bit on the shelf. It's just one of those convenience things. It's really nice to have a protein ready to go that I can just pull off the shelf as I need it. So I did 2 chickens today. I just pulled 2 of our chickens that we raised out of the freezer, and I'm going to be partially cooking these whole chickens. I'm doing this in a big roasting pan in the oven from frozen. Now, you can raw pack chicken. I know many people prefer to do it that way, but we raise our own chicken and it just makes more sense for me to do it this way versus taking the time to part out a chicken just to can it. Now, one, I need to have the foresight then to make sure that I completely thaw a chicken prior to needing to can it, but it's also just one more step. So by partially cooking the chicken just enough that it's easy to remove from the bones, it, to me, I find makes the process a lot quicker. So I just put those into my stainless steel roaster. I did put the lid on it as well, and that went into a 350-degree oven for a couple hours. This weekend really was me just getting to some of the things I've needed to for a while, and one of those things was jarring up honey. It's not always my favorite task because it can be a sticky mess, but these honey gates really do help with this versus using a funnel and spooning it into jars, which is what I have done in the past. So this year's honey is much darker than last year's. I had a little bit of a previous year's honey left to use up that had crystallized a bit, so I also got that jarred up, and you can see just how much of a difference there is between the different years. It is later in the day now, and by this point the chicken was done partially cooking and it had cooled off enough that I was able to handle it. So I just went ahead and got that all shredded, added it to a large bowl, and I left the bones in the roaster so that I could also make up a big batch of chicken broth. So I'm just filling my pint-sized wide mouth jars to 1 inch of headspace. I'm going to top those off with water. You could also do chicken broth in place of the water, and then I'll debubble, get the rims of the jars cleaned up really well. I like to use some vinegar for that, then add my lids and the rings on to fingertip tight, and these are ready for the pressure canner. Once the canner was coming down from pressure and I knew I would have the stove space again, I went ahead and started to prep a few things that I'm going to add into the chicken broth to add a bit of flavor. So a lot of times I will can up just plain chicken broth, unseasoned, and I like to do that just for versatility, but I like to also have a variety on the shelf. So I am just adding a couple carrots, a couple small onions that we had from the garden that I need to use up, as well as about a head of garlic. I often will keep a bit of veggie scraps in the freezer to add into broth, but I didn't have any on hand, so this is what I'm doing, and you really don't need a whole lot to still get good flavor. I'm gonna allow this broth to simmer all night long, and I did also add in some dehydrated celery leaves from the garden. I really like to have these specifically for broth. That's pretty much the only way that I end up using it, but that way I'm not using any of our celery from the garden in broth, and I just brought that up to a boil, then reduced it down to a simmer. I did cover that with the lid of the roasting pan, and that's just going to simmer overnight. The next morning, my broth was done and ready to go, so I got that strained off into a large pot with a fine mesh strainer, and I'm going to be canning these in quart jars. Today I did 7 quarts because that's what my canner holds in one go. I'm filling my jars to 1 inch of headspace. Again, I'm also going to go in with vinegar to clean off the rims really well, just to make sure that I'm going to get a good seal. I do also try and skim off as much of the fat from the broth as I can so it doesn't interfere with the seal. The easiest way to do this is if you cool the broth overnight, then the fat will rise to the top, it will harden, and it makes it super easy to remove. And then I like to save that for cooking, but I just skimmed it off the best I could today. The broth is going to process for 25 minutes in the pressure canner. I spent some time this afternoon just getting the canning room all organized. I have a tendency to bring jars down as I'm done with them or as I finish canning up a batch and not immediately putting them away. So I had a little bit of work to do in there today to clean up some stuff that had just been brought down there and not dealt with, and also to get this weekend's jars rotated and put away. I had one jar that was not quite full of tomato sauce that I decided to go ahead and can anyway. It's just going to be the first that I use. I knew that I didn't have an immediate need for it, so I didn't want to keep it fresh in the fridge. And our tomato products, you know, organizing all of this made me realize that they're looking a little bit slim. I still have lots of tomato soup that I canned up last year, which is delicious, but I need to get to some more of the tomatoes that I have in the freezer to get us restocked up on tomato sauce. Thank you for joining me this weekend in the kitchen as I got a few little tasks done that have been on my to-do list. I appreciate you watching, and I'll see you in the next video.